The second time my mother tried to sell me, I was sitting across from her in a $4.8 million penthouse on the 31st floor of the Aldridge, holding the trust document that made me richer than every person she had ever begged from. And she still hadn't noticed the date on page 4 was wrong. I was 34 years old that morning. A structural restoration architect who could tell you the load tolerance of a 100-year-old beam just by pressing my palm against it, and the one habit my mother always hated was that I read everything twice before I signed it, slowly, with my finger under each line. She used to say it made me look stupid in front of people who mattered. That habit was the only reason I was alive to be sitting in that room at all, and it was about to become the reason she lost everything she'd spent 2 lifetimes building on my back. If you're new here, welcome back to Elena's Rebirth life, where betrayal never gets the final word. The first time I was 26, living in a rented room above a dry cleaner's on Belmont Street in Albany, paying $640 a month for a mattress and a window that didn't close all the way, and my mother called me on a Tuesday in March using the voice she only used when she needed something. She said Uncle Ray was in town. She said there was a man she wanted me to meet, a wonderful man, a man named Preston Argyle who owned 40% of a logistics company out of Hartford and had just turned 41 and was, she said, ready to settle down. She said it like she was reading off a grocery list. I didn't know yet that she'd already taken $90,000 from him 3 weeks earlier as what she called a introduction gift. Money that went straight into paying off the second mortgage on the house she put in only her name. The house I'd grown up believing was half mine because my father's life insurance had paid for the roof. I met Preston at a restaurant called Ember and Vine in downtown Hartford, a place with low gold lighting and a wine list that didn't show prices, and he ordered for both of us without asking, and I told myself that was confidence instead of control because I was 26 and lonely and tired of being broke and tired of my mother's voice on the phone every Sunday telling me I'd wasted my engineering degree on a hobby that doesn't pay. He had a way of touching the stem of his glass when he talked about money, turning it a quarter turn like he was checking a combination lock. I noticed it and didn't think anything of it. That was my first mistake, not the noticing, the not thinking. We were married 11 months later at a hotel called the Brennick in Hartford, 214 guests, a 4-tier cake from a bakery on Asylum Street that my mother picked without asking me, and during the toast my mother stood up holding a champagne flute she hadn't paid for and said, "I always knew my daughter would land somewhere worth landing," and the room laughed like it was sweet. I laughed too. I didn't understand yet that I was the thing that had landed, not the one doing the landing. For the first 2 years, it didn't look like anything. That's the part people don't believe when I tell it now. It didn't look like anything. Preston paid for an apartment in West Hartford with a view of Elizabeth Park. He bought me a 2019 Audi Q5 for our first anniversary. He let me keep consulting part-time for a restoration firm called Brackridge & Sons on small jobs, churches mostly, a courthouse cornice in New Haven once. My mother visited every 6 weeks and always left with something, and a check, a gift card, a small loan, a piece of jewelry she said she was just borrowing to get appraised. I counted once in the 3rd year, almost without meaning to. $214,000 in 18 months, moving from my husband's accounts through me and into hers, always with my signature on the transfer because Preston said it looked better coming from family. And I signed because by then I had learned that asking questions made the air in our apartment go thin and cold for days. The thing I trusted was simple and stupid and human. I trusted that being useful would keep me safe. I trusted that if I never complained, never costed anyone anything, never made a scene, I would eventually be let alone. I ignored the way Preston's assistant, a woman named Carol Musina, started CCing my mother on emails about household budgeting that had nothing to do with my mother. I ignored the locksmith receipt I found in a coat pocket for a storage unit on Brainerd Road that I didn't know we had. I ignored my mother's new car, a leased black Mercedes GLC, appearing in her driveway 4 months after I signed papers I was told were Just refinancing the West Hartford unit. For tax reasons, your accountant said it's fine, except I never had an accountant. Preston had an accountant. His name was Felix Dory, and he had an office on Pratt Street, and he billed in 15-minute increments, and not once in 4 years did he speak to me directly about anything with my name on it. The exact scene where I was destroyed happened on a Thursday. In October, 11:40 in the morning, in the kitchen of the West Hartford apartment, sun coming in wrong through the blinds and laying yellow stripes across the counter. I had a stomach flu that wouldn't quit, 4 days of it. Fever climbing at night and dropping by morning, and I asked Preston if we could push back signing the refinance documents until I felt well enough to read them properly. He set a stack of papers on the counter next to my untouched tea and said, "Your mother already signed her part. It's just your signature now. You don't want to be the reason this falls through, do you?" Carol Messina was standing by the door the whole time, holding a folder against her chest like a shield, and she didn't look at me once. I signed without reading. Page 4 had a clause transferring my 40% interest in the consulting firm's accounts receivable, money I'd earned, invoiced under my own name, into a joint account that I would learn 3 weeks later had already been drained down to $312. By December, my fever had turned into something the urgent care doctor on Farmington Avenue called an unusually persistent post-viral infection and told me to follow up if it got worse, and it got worse, and nobody followed up because by then, Preston had stopped coming home before midnight, and my mother had stopped answering on the second ring. I called her from a hospital bed at St. Francis. On the night of January 9th, my temperature at 103.4, a nurse named Denise threading a second IV line into my left hand because the first one had infiltrated, and I asked my mother to come, and she said, "I have an event tonight, sweetheart. Can it wait until morning?" And I said it might not be able to wait. And she said in the gentlest voice, the voice that always meant she'd already decided something, "You've always been dramatic when you're sick." She did not come that night. She did not come the next morning. The last thing I remember clearly from that life is the ceiling tile above my bed, a water stain shaped almost like Ohio, and the sound of my own heartbeat on a monitor going faster than it should, and a sentence in my own head that wasn't fear so much as a kind of flat, final arithmetic. Nobody is coming, and nobody is going to be made to answer for it. I have thought about that ceiling tile more times than I can count. I have thought about the way the sound of the monitor sped up before anyone in Scrubs noticed. Septic shock. The discharge paperwork would have said if there had ever been discharge paperwork, if I had ever left that room the way a person is supposed to leave a hospital room. Instead, I woke up. It was 7:58 in the morning, and the room smelled like printer toner and the particular sourness of a Keurig left on too long, and the first thing I felt was the rough weave of a blazer cuff against my wrist, my own blazer, and I was sitting in a leather chair in the lobby of a notary's office on Pearl Street that I recognized instantly because I had been here before, 4 years before, signing the marriage prenup that wasn't really a prenup so much as a list of things I agreed never to ask for. The receptionist, a heavy-set woman with a name tag that said Tracy, was saying, "Ms. Kale, they're ready for you." And I sat there for 1 full second doing nothing because the last thing I remembered was a water stain shaped like Ohio and a heartbeat too fast to be mine, and now I was 26 again with both hands whole and unbruised and a stomach that didn't hurt, and somewhere behind me a phone was ringing with a ringtone I hadn't heard in 9 years. I tested it the way you test ice on a pond. Small weight first. "Tracy," I said, "what's today's date?" She glanced at her monitor without suspicion. "The 14th. You want me to write you a slip?" March 14th. 11 days before the wedding announcement would run in the Hartford Courant. 4 years and 10 months before a ceiling tile shaped like Ohio. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me more than the rest of it. Preston was already in the small conference room when Tracy walked me in, turning the stem of an empty water glass a quarter turn between 2 fingers, that same motion, the combination lock motion, and across from him sat a notary named Arthur Penn with a stamp and a folder, and standing by the window with her purse held against her stomach, Like always was my mother, Dolores Whitfield Cale, 51 years old in this version of the morning, wearing the cream-colored Anne Klein blazer she'd buy again, the same one because she loved that blazer enough to wear it to two of the worst things she would ever do to me. "There she is," my mother said, the way she always said it. Like I'd been missing and she'd found me. "Sit down, sweetheart. Arthur doesn't have all day. Last time I signed without reading. I had signed the prenup in 9 minutes. Eager to be liked, eager to be done. Eager to prove I wasn't the difficult daughter she always implied I was." This time I picked up the folder and Arthur Penn slid a pen across the table, a cheap blue Bic with a chewed cap, and I said, "Can I get a coffee first? I want to actually read this." My mother's mouth did something small and fast. There and gone, a flicker of irritation she covered with a laugh. "It's the same document we talked about on the phone," she said. "There's nothing new in it." "Then it won't take long to read," I said, and opened it to page 1. It took 40 minutes. Arthur Penn checked his watch twice. Preston's jaw worked once, briefly, the muscle jumping near his ear, a tell I'd never had the calm to notice the first time, because the first time I was too busy being grateful someone wanted me. On page 6, clause 4, C, there was language granting Preston sole discretionary authority over any jointly titled or commingled assets, language broad enough to swallow a house whole. And on page 9, there was a line naming Dolores Whitfield Cale as a contingent beneficiary on a life insurance policy I didn't know existed, $250,000, my name on the policy, hers on the payout if anything happened to me within the first 5 years of marriage. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't raise my voice. I had spent the last 9 years of a life nobody else remembered, learning exactly what happens to a woman who raises her voice in a room full of people who've already decided what she's worth. I asked very calmly, why would there be a life insurance clause in a prenuptial agreement? "Standard practice," Preston said too quickly, the glass stem turning again. "It's for your protection," my mother said. "God forbid something happens to you, sweetheart. You'd want me taken care of, wouldn't you?" I looked at her for 3 full seconds, the same woman who would one day tell a nurse named Denise that I had always been dramatic when I was sick, the same woman whose voice I had already heard say that sentence once in a life she would never remember living through, and I felt the old fear move through my chest like cold water finding a crack. The same fear that used to make me say yes just to make the air warm up again. I let it pass through me instead of stopping there. "I'll need a copy to take home," I said. "I want my own attorney to look at this before I sign anything." Arthur Penn looked relieved, like a man given permission to be the reasonable one. My mother's face did the thing it did when she was recalculating, a stillness around the eyes while the rest of her face kept smiling, and Preston said, almost gently, almost kindly, in the voice he used when he wanted something and was willing to wait 9 seconds for it, "Of course, take your time, baby." He had called me that in the restaurant at Ember and Vine the very first night, 3 weeks after the $90,000 had already moved, and I remembered now that he'd used the word baby the way some men use a leash, soft until you pull. I left with the folder. I did not cry until I was alone in the elevator, and even then it was only for the 4 floors down, one slow breath in through the nose and out through the mouth, my reflection in the brushed steel doors looking like a stranger who'd just learned to swim. I want to be clear that I didn't suddenly become someone else. I was still afraid of my mother's voice on the phone. I still flinched at certain words. Disappointing, ungrateful, after everything I've done. The way you flinch at a sound, your body remembers even when your mind has moved on. But I had something now that I hadn't had the first time, which was proof that the future was not fixed, and a memory of exactly how this house of cards had been built brick by brick, lie by quiet lie. Over 4 years, I would not be living through the same way twice. I went to a lawyer named Renata Boyce, a contracts attorney with an office above a UPS store on Farmington Avenue, the kind of overworked, underpaid lawyer who actually reads things, and I paid her $340 out of my own savings I had built back up dollar by dollar from consulting fees my mother hadn't found a way to touch yet. to mark up every page of that prenup in red ink. She circled clause 4C twice and wrote vague, strike, or define in the margin. She circled the insurance clause and wrote simply, why? You're allowed to ask for changes, Renata told me, sliding the marked up pages back across her desk, her office smelling like burnt coffee and the eucalyptus spray she used on her hands between appointments. A lot of people don't realize that. They think the contract in front of them is the only contract that exists. I had needed 9 years and 1 death to learn that. I wasn't going to need a 10th. I went back to Preston with Renata's notes instead of the original folder, and I watched him read them at his kitchen counter, the same counter where, in another version of this story, Son would lay yellow stripes across the granite while I signed away $250,000 to keep the peace. He set the pages down. He turned the water glass a quarter turn even though it was empty. You hired a lawyer? He said. Not a question. I read things twice now. I said. I'm told it's a flaw. He laughed, a short, surprised sound, like he'd bumped into furniture that used to be somewhere else. Your mother said you'd sign whatever I put in front of you. It was the first piece of evidence I didn't have to go looking for. He'd handed it to me unprompted because they both assumed that the version of me sitting across from him was still the version who needed to be told she was loved before she'd noticed she was being used. I tucked the sentence away the way you tuck away a receipt you don't yet know you'll need, and I said mildly, she knows me better than most people, I guess, and let him think that was agreement instead of inventory. We were married 5 months later than the first time because I insisted on a longer engagement to plan properly, and in those 5 months I did 3 things nobody in that family noticed me doing. I opened a separate consulting account at a credit union on New Britain Avenue that neither Preston nor my mother knew existed, and I started invoicing Brackridge and Sons jobs through it instead of through the joint account I'd be pressured into 6 weeks after the wedding. I asked Felix Dorey, the accountant, 3 specific questions about how trust distributions worked in Connecticut, framed as innocent curiosity about Preston's family structure, and wrote down his answers in a notebook I kept in a drawer at my restoration firm, not at home. And I called my Aunt Marisol, my father's sister, the only person in that family who had ever once told me the truth about my mother out loud at my father's funeral in a parking lot in a whisper, don't let her decide things for you, baby. She decided things for your father too, and look where it got him. And I asked her casually, over coffee at a diner on New Park Avenue, whether she remembered anything about my father's side of the family having money. She went quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee with a spoon she wasn't using for sugar, and said, your grandfather Eli had a trust set up before you were born. Your mother fought him on it for years, said it should come to her since she was raising you. He didn't listen. Why are you asking? I didn't know yet what that trust was. I knew it existed, which was more than I'd known 9 years and 1 death ago, and that was the first domino, though I wouldn't understand how big it was for another 14 months. The wedding happened at the Brennick again, same hotel, fewer guests this time, 168 instead of 214 because I'd quietly trimmed my mother's guest list of business contacts she'd wanted to impress with my marriage, and she'd been furious in the specific controlled way she got furious, which was never loud, always a kind of cold precision, a sentence delivered once and then silence for 3 days. You're embarrassing me in front of people who matter, she'd said, and I'd said, it's my wedding. And she'd said nothing else for 72 hours, which used to be the worst punishment in the world and now felt strangely like relief. At the reception, she stood with the same champagne flute she hadn't paid for and said the same words almost exactly. I always knew my daughter would land somewhere worth landing, and this time I didn't laugh along. I smiled the smile you give a stranger on a train, polite, distant, and I thought, you have no idea how far this is going to fall, and the thought didn't feel like hatred so much as a kind of cold, clean arithmetic, the same kind I'd had on the ceiling tile night, except now it had somewhere to go. The first 18 months of the second marriage looked almost exactly like the first 18 months of the first one because I let them. I let Preston buy the West Hartford apartment with the view of Elizabeth Park. I let him buy me a car, though I asked for a Honda CR-V instead of the Audi, cheaper, harder to repossess as a status statement, and he looked faintly disappointed when I said I'd rather have the savings, which told me something about how he kept score. I let my mother visit every 6 weeks. I let her ask for things. The first time she asked for a small loan just to bridge a gap, you know how property taxes are, I gave her $4,000 from the joint account, the account Preston watched because I needed her to believe nothing had changed, and the second time she asked, 4 months later, for $11,000 toward an investment Preston's people are already in, I told her I'd need to talk to my financial advisor first. Since when do you have a financial advisor? She asked in the kitchen of the West Hartford apartment. The same kitchen, sun coming in through the same blinds, though this time it was July and the stripes of light fell green through new leaves instead of October yellow. Since I started taking my own money seriously, I said, and watched something behind her eyes recalibrate fast, the same recalibration I'd seen in the notary's office, a woman doing math on a face that was still smiling. The financial advisor was real. Her name was Joan Okafor. She had an office in a converted house on Sigourney Street, and I'd found her through Renata Boyce, who'd told me over our third meeting, if you're serious about protecting yourself long term, you need someone watching the money who answers to you and only you. Joan was the second domino. She was the one who, 11 months into the marriage, pulled records on the trust my grandfather Eli had set up and discovered it hadn't dissolved when he died the way my mother had always told me. It had simply never been activated, sitting in a holding structure at a firm called Whitcomb and Lowry on Asylum Street, because activation required the beneficiary, me, to formally claim it at or after age 30. And nobody, not my mother, not anyone, had ever told me that age 30 was a key that existed. Your mother is listed as trustee until you turn 30, Joan told me, sliding a printout across her desk, her office smelling like the orange peel candle burning on the windowsill, which means for the last 8 years she's had legal access to manage, not spend, manage. Assets currently valued at $2.3 million. Did you know that? I had not known that. I had grown up in a house with a leaking roof my father's life insurance supposedly paid for, eating dinner some nights that was just eggs and toast because my mother said money was tight, while $2.3 million sat in a trust with her name on the management line. I sat in Joan's office for a long moment without saying anything, and she was kind enough not to fill the silence, and what I felt wasn't shock exactly. It was the specific, sick recognition of finally seeing the shape of a thing you'd always felt the edges of in the dark. I want to know everything she's done with management access. I said, every transaction, every fee, everything. It took Joan and a forensic accountant she brought in, a quiet, precise man named Dorian Vance who billed $310 an hour and was worth every cent of it, 4 months to build the full picture, and the picture, when it finally came together on a Tuesday in November, was this. My mother had drawn $14,200 a year in trustee management fees, legal, technically, if generously interpreted, for 8 years, and had additionally 3 separate times moved sums of $30,000, $42,500, and $61,000 out of the trust's investment account into a personal account at a bank in Bloomfield, each time logged as a temporary bridge loan against future distributions, each time never repaid, each time, Dorian noted dryly, occurring within 6 weeks of a documented financial hardship claimed verbally to the beneficiary. He meant me. He meant the eggs and toast dinners. He meant a woman manufacturing scarcity in front of her daughter's face while quietly draining a fortune that daughter didn't know she had. I didn't confront her. Not yet. This was the part of the second life that took the most out of me, more than any single conversation. The simple daily discipline of not confronting her, of sitting at her kitchen table, eating the pot roast she still made every other Sunday, the same recipe dry on the edges because she always overcooked it, and saying nothing while I carried a folder's worth of her theft in a drawer at my office. There were nights I cried in my car in the parking lot of her building before I could make myself drive home, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went pale because some old, exhausted part of me still wanted her to just be my mother, still wanted, even now, even with all of it laid out in Dorian Vance's careful spreadsheets, for none of it to be true. But I had died once already believing she would come if I called loudly enough. I wasn't going to call loudly this time. I was going to make her perform her own undoing in front of an audience, the way she had always performed devotion in front of one. The third domino was Carol Musina. In the first life, Carol had stood by a door holding a folder against her chest and looked away while I signed my consulting earnings into a joint account that would be empty 3 weeks later. In the second life, 8 months into the marriage, I started bringing Carol coffee, small thing, a cortado from a place called Tulip Coffee on Farmington Avenue twice a week. When I came by Preston's office to drop off something or pick him up for dinner, I asked about her son, who had a soccer tournament in Simsbury. I asked about her mother, who'd had a hip replacement. I never asked about Preston. I let 4 months pass before I asked her, gently, on a Thursday when Preston was in Hartford at a vendor meeting and the office was quiet except for the hum of the copier, whether she'd ever noticed anything about the accounts that bothered her. She didn't answer that day. She looked at the coffee cup in her hand and turned it the way I'd watched Preston turn his water glass 1,000 times. And she said, I have a job to keep. And I said, I know, and left it there, because pushing would have closed a door I needed to stay open a crack longer. It opened 3 months after that on a rainy Tuesday in February when Carol called my cell phone, not the office line, my personal cell, a number Preston didn't have memorized because he'd never once needed to call me himself, and said in a voice that had clearly been rehearsed and still came out shaking, I need you to know something and I need you to never tell anyone it came from me. There had been a transfer 2 weeks earlier, $76,000 out of an account that held proceeds from a property sale, a rental triplex on Garden Street that I didn't even know Preston owned, bought, it turned out, with money quietly siphoned from the joint account over our first 18 months together, and the transfer had gone to an account in my mother's name. Not a loan memo this time, not a gift memo. The wire description read, in full settlement services rendered per agreement March 14th, the date of the notary appointment. The date everything in this life had started over. I sat with that wire description for 3 days before I understood it wasn't a coincidence of timing. It was a number. It was, Dorian Vance confirmed when I brought it to him with shaking hands, almost certainly a reference code, an internal shorthand for an arrangement, and when he cross-referenced it against an old filing from Whitcomb and Lowry that Joan had pulled as part of the trust review, he found a memo 4 years old in the first life and freshly written in this one, an actual written memo from my mother to Preston's family attorney, a man named Garrett Holm, outlining compensation expectations related to the introduction and ongoing facilitation of the Cale-Argyle Union, with a number at the bottom, $90,000 upon introduction, additional sums as warranted by continued cooperation. She had a price list. My mother had a literal itemized price list for selling me to a man, and she had been collecting against it for years in both lives. And the only difference this time was that I had a forensic accountant, a financial advisor, a contracts lawyer, and a woman named Carol Musina who'd finally decided her conscience weighed more than her paycheck. I almost broke that week. I want to say that honestly, because the version of this story where I'm calm the entire way through isn't true. I sat in my office at the restoration firm on a Friday night with the memo printed out in front of me, the building empty except for the hum of the HVAC system, and I cried the way I hadn't let myself cry since the ceiling tile shaped like Ohio, not loud, just steady, my shoulders shaking, the paper damp at one corner where a tear hit it before I could move it away. I called Aunt Marisol. She didn't ask questions. She just stayed on the phone with me for 40 minutes while I breathed, and at the end she said, your father used to say your mother could make you feel guilty for the weather. Don't let her make you feel guilty for surviving her. I went home that night and I didn't tell Preston anything was wrong. I made dinner, I asked about his day, I let him think the woman across the table was still the one who'd land softly, no matter how far she fell, because that belief was the only leverage I had left, and leverage you reveal too early is leverage you've already lost. The fourth escalation came 11 months later on the night of our second anniversary at a restaurant called Restaurant L and E on Asylum Avenue. White tablecloths, a $58 bottle of Sancerre Preston ordered without asking, and my mother joining us for just one course, I won't intrude, wearing the cream Anne Klein blazer. The same one, even though it had a small button missing on the left cuff that she'd never bothered fixing in either life. Halfway through the entree, she set down her fork and said in the gentle, devastating way she always delivered her worst news, "Preston and I have been talking, and we think it might be time to look at consolidating some of your accounts under one advisor. It's just smarter, sweetheart, for tax purposes." I felt the old fear move again, the cold water through the crack, the urge to say yes immediately just to keep the table warm. I let it pass through. I picked up my wine glass, took one slow sip, and said, "Which advisor were you thinking?" "Garrett's office can recommend someone." Preston said, "Garrett Holm, the family attorney, the man who'd received the memo with the price list at the bottom." "I actually already have an advisor I trust," I said. "Joan Okafor, she's been wonderful." My mother's smile thinned by maybe 2 millimeters, an amount nobody at that table but me would have measured, and she said, "I've never heard of her." "She's very good at keeping things private," I said, and smiled and reached for the bread and let the silence that followed do whatever work it wanted to do. That was the fourth domino. Though they didn't know it yet, I had let them see, just slightly, that I was no longer moving alone, no longer easy to consolidate, no longer the 26-year-old who signed a prenup in 9 minutes because she was grateful to be wanted. Preston's jaw worked once near his ear. My mother turned her water glass. She'd picked up his habit somewhere over the years, or maybe he'd picked it up from her. I never did figure out which direction that particular tell traveled. A quarter turn, and said nothing else about advisors for the rest of the meal. The fifth domino, the one that finally gave me everything I needed, came from a place I hadn't expected. My own grandmother. Not Eli's widow. She'd passed when I was 12, but Preston's grandmother, a sharp, unsentimental 91-year-old named Lenora Argyle who lived in an assisted living facility called Brightwell Manor in Avon and who had never liked my mother, not once, not for one single dinner in either version of this marriage. Lenora had outlived a husband, 2 sons, and most of her patients for performance, and on a Sunday visit 8 months before the end, she took my hand in both of hers. Paper-thin skin, a wedding ring she'd worn for 61 years, loose enough now to spin freely on her finger, and said, "You're not stupid, are you? I've been waiting to see if you were going to figure it out before it was too late." "Figure out what?" I said, careful, the way you're careful around a door that might be a trap or might be the only way out. My grandson's father set aside a controlling share of Argyle logistics for whichever of his sons made a marriage that lasted. She said, "Preston's brother divorced 11 years ago. Preston's the only one left in the running. There's a clause, I read it myself, I made my own lawyer explain it twice, that the controlling share transfers on the 5th wedding anniversary, automatically, unless there's been a divorce filing or a documented affair on record before that date." She paused, and her eyes, pale blue and entirely clear, found mine. "You're 4 years and 2 months in. Preston knows the date better than he knows his own birthday. So does your mother, I'd imagine, given how closely she watches his calendar." I went home that night and didn't sleep. I lay in the dark next to a man who had spent 4 years treating me like a line item, and I understood, finally, completely, the shape of the trap I had nearly died inside the first time. It had never only been about my trust or my consulting income or even the $90,000 introduction fee. It had been about a controlling share of a logistics company worth, Dorian Vance would later estimate from public filings, and a leaked appraisal Carol Musina slipped me in a coffee sleeve somewhere north of $19 million. My mother hadn't sold me for $90,000. She'd sold me for a 5-year option on $19 million, and the introduction fee was just her advance. I thought about the ceiling tile shaped like Ohio. I thought about a nurse named Denise threading an IV into my left hand, while my mother told me, gently, that I'd always been dramatic when I was sick. I thought about the fact that in that life, I had died 9 days before what would have been our 4th wedding anniversary. 9 days before, I now understood with a clarity that made my stomach drop. The point at which a documented affair or a divorce filing would have permanently voided Preston's claim on the controlling share, the point at which keeping me alive but compliant for 1 more year stopped being profitable compared to a clean, sympathetic widowhood with the insurance payout and the share intact and no inconvenient ex-wife around to ever read a document twice. I had not died of sepsis. Sepsis was just the mechanism. I had died of a calendar. That was the night the plan stopped being defensive and became something else. I called Renata Boyce the next morning and asked her a single question. In Connecticut, if a wife could prove with documentation that a marriage had been entered into and maintained under financially coercive conditions orchestrated jointly by a spouse and a third party for material gain, could that void or substantially complicate inheritance and trust clauses tied to marriage longevity, especially if the third party had a fiduciary relationship to the wife at the time? Renata went quiet on the phone for a long moment and then said slowly, "That's not a hypothetical question, is it?" And I said, "No, it wasn't." And she said, "Send me everything you have." Everything. I sent her everything. The marked up prenup, the wired description with the date code, the memo with the price list, Jones Trust audit, Dorian's 8 years of trustee transactions, Carol's recorded statement, cited taken with her permission, and on tape in Renata's office with Renata present so it would hold up as something more than gossip. Lenora Argyle's account of the inheritance clause, which Renata had independently confirmed existed by pulling the actual corporate succession filing, a document that listed in dry legal language exactly the contingency the old woman had described. We had 4 months before the 5th anniversary. We used every week of them. I started quietly, moving my consulting income further out of reach, not in a way that would alarm anyone, just routine-looking transfers into retirement accounts Joan helped me set up under ISA protections that even a determined lawyer would struggle to unwind quickly. I asked Felix Story, the accountant, one more set of innocent questions about how trust distributions at age 30 actually got triggered, and learned that the trigger was a formal written claim filed with Whitcomb and Lowry, meaning my mother's 8 years of management access could end the moment I turned 30 and filed the paperwork, which I was now 11 weeks from being able to do. I asked Carol Messina gently whether she still had access to the shared drive where wire confirmations were archived, and she said yes, and 3 weeks later she handed me, in a sealed envelope inside a paper coffee bag, printed confirmations of 2 more transfers I hadn't known about, $22,000 to my mother in January, logged as consulting Sidnokor, though my mother had never consulted on anything in her life, and a transfer of $8,500 to Garrett Holmes' firm trust account, logged simply as retainer Mio ongoing matter. The retainer was the detail that finally made Renata sit back in her chair and say, quietly, "They're planning something around your birthday. They wouldn't need an ongoing retainer with a family attorney for a marriage they think is stable." I turned 30 on a Saturday in April. I did not tell my mother. I filed the formal claim with Whitcomb and Lowry on the Monday following, a single sheet of paper and a notarized signature. The same kind of signature I used to give away without reading, except this time I read every line, and within 9 business days, the trust amount $2.3 million minus the 8 years of management fees and 3 undocumented bridge loans Dorian had already flagged for formal recovery, was, for the first time in my life, mine to direct. My mother found out by accident, the way she found out most things that mattered, because Felix Story mentioned it to Garrett Holm at a Rotary Club lunch on Pratt Street, assuming it was old news, and Garrett mentioned it to my mother that same evening over the phone, and my mother called me within the hour, her voice doing the thing it did when she was frightened and trying not to sound frightened, bright, and clipped at the edges. "You didn't tell me you'd claimed Eli's trust," she said. "No, hello. I didn't think it concerned you," I said. "You're not the trustee anymore." A long silence. I could hear faintly a television in the background, the specific cadence of an evening news anchor. "I managed that money for 8 years, she said. "Kept it safe. The least you could do is thank me." I thought about $14,200 a year in fees. I thought about $30,000, $42,500, $61,000 in bridge loans and never repaid. I thought about eggs and toast for dinner while a fortune sat in a Bloomfield bank account with her name on the withdrawal slip. "I'll thank you," I said, "when I see the accounting." Another silence, longer this time, and then in a voice gone suddenly thin, "What accounting?" "The one Whitcomb and Lowry is required to produce now that the trust has activated," I said, which was true and which I knew would send her and Garrett Holm scrambling through 8 years of records looking for anything that could be cleaned up, reclassified, or buried before a forensic eye landed on it. Except I already had Dorian Vance's version of that same accounting complete and dated and notarized, sitting in a fireproof box in a storage unit I rented under my maiden name at a facility on New Britain Avenue that neither my mother nor Preston knew existed. She tried one more time to fold me back into the old shape, 11 days later calling to invite me to lunch at a place called the Capitol Grill downtown, a corner table she'd specifically requested her treat, just us girls, and over salads neither of us finished, she reached across the table and took my hand and said, "I know things have felt strange, sweetheart, but you have to understand, everything I've ever done was to make sure you'd be taken care of. I didn't have anyone looking out for me the way I look out for you." I let her hold my hand for a moment. I thought about a nurse named Denise. I thought about the words, "You've always been dramatic when you're sick," words I had never once said aloud to her in this life, words she had never once spoken in this life either, and yet I could feel them sitting in the space between us anyway, like a scar from a wound that technically hadn't happened yet, or had happened once in a version of time only I remembered, which made the wound no less real and the woman across the table no less guilty of inflicting it. "I know you believe that," I said, and meant it, because I had come slowly to understand that my mother's cruelty wasn't strategic in the cold, cinematic way I used to imagine. It was hungrier than that, and more ordinary, the cruelty of a woman who had decided very early in her own life that love was a resource to be extracted rather than given, and who had simply never once questioned whether her daughter was a person or a position in a portfolio. Understanding that didn't make me forgive her. It made the plan easier to finish because pity, it turns out, is a poor reason to stop someone from doing the same thing to someone else's daughter next. The fifth and final domino was the gala. Argyle Logistics held its annual shareholder dinner every June at the Society Room, a restored 1920s bank building on Asylum Street with marble columns and a vault door repurposed as a wine cellar entrance, the kind of place that photographs well for the annual report. This year's dinner fell 9 days before the 5th wedding anniversary, by design, because Preston's father had structured the inheritance clause decades earlier to be confirmed publicly at this exact event, a tradition meant to look like a celebration of family continuity and mostly functioning, I'd come to understand, as a way to humiliate any son who hadn't measured up in time for the cameras. 210 guests, board members, major shareholders, a reporter from the Hartford Business Journal, Lenora Argyle, 91, seated at the head table because no one had yet found a polite way to stop inviting her. Renata and I planned the evening the way you'd plan a structural reinforcement. Load-bearing points first, then the rest, built around them so nothing could shift before it was supposed to. Carol Mussina, who'd quietly resigned from Preston's office 6 weeks earlier, citing a family health matter, and was, as of that resignation, no longer bound by any duty of confidentiality to him, agreed to attend as Renata's guest. Dorian Vance prepared a single-page summary, notarized, easy enough to read aloud in under 90 seconds. Joan Okafor sent 2 days before the dinner a formal written notice to Whitcomb and Lowry and to Garrett Holmes' office confirming that the trust's full distribution and accounting had been finalized, a notice that, by law, both my mother and Preston's family attorney would receive copies of, meaning by the night of the dinner, they already knew the numbers existed. They simply didn't know I was bringing them into the room. I wore a navy dress I'd bought myself with my own consulting money, no help from anyone, and I did my own makeup in the bathroom mirror of the West Hartford apartment, while Preston knotted his tie in the next room, talking almost giddy about how his father would have been proud, how the board had been very complimentary about his stability this year, how Garrett had said the transfer paperwork was basically a formality at this point. I listened to all of it. I said, yes, well, hey, I'm proud of you too. Yet there, and watched his shoulders relax, the way they always relaxed when he believed he had me fully accounted for. The dinner began the way these things always begin. Soft piano, a string of small talk, the particular clink of 200 glasses being filled at once, the smell of seared scallops and candle wax and someone's too strong cologne 3 tables over. My mother arrived in a burgundy gown and the cream Anne Klein blazer draped over her arm for later, missing button and all, and air-kissed 3 board members' wives before she even found her seat. Preston's father had died 4 years earlier in this version of events too, so it fell to the company's general counsel, a tall, soft-spoken man named Ezra Whitlock, to make the formal remarks at the appointed time. Just after dessert, a small velvet box on the head table containing a signed share transfer certificate that would make Preston, on paper, the largest single individual shareholder in a $19 million logistics company. Ezra stood. The room quieted in the obedient way rooms full of people with money quiet down. 5 years ago, he began, Preston Argyle made a commitment, and tonight, in keeping with a tradition this family has honored for 3 generations, we're here to recognize. Before you do that, I said, standing, my voice not loud, not shaking, pitched exactly the way Renata and I had practiced in her office above the UPS store, I think everyone in this room deserves to know what that commitment actually was. The piano had already stopped. 210 faces turned. The way faces turn at a wedding when someone says they object, except no one had any idea yet what they were objecting to. Naomi, Preston said, low, a warning, the same tone he'd used in a kitchen 9 years ago and 4 years ago when he'd told me your mother already signed her part. It's just your signature now. I have a document here, I said. And Renata, seated 3 tables back, rose and crossed the room to hand it to me, dated 4 years and 2 months ago, addressed to Garrett Holmes, outlining a compensation arrangement of $90,000 for introducing me to Preston Argyle with additional payments contingent on, and I'm quoting, continued cooperation. It's signed by my mother. A sound went through the room, not gasps exactly, something quieter and more dangerous, the sound of 200 people simultaneously deciding to stop pretending they weren't listening. My mother's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. She started to rise, started to say my name in the gentle, devastating voice, and I kept going before the room could decide it had heard enough. There's a wire transfer, I said, dated 2 years ago for $76,000, logged with the reference code settlement. Services rendered per agreement March 14th. March 14th is the date my mother and my husband finalized the terms of our marriage at a notary's office on Pearl Street before I'd even said yes. I held up the second page. There's a retainer payment to Mr. Holmes' office, $8,500, made 11 weeks ago for, and again, I'm quoting the ledger description, an ongoing matter. Filed 3 days after my husband and my mother discussed over dinner at restaurant L&E, consolidating my accounts under an advisor of their choosing. This is a private family matter. Garrett Holmes said from somewhere near the head table, standing now, his voice pitched for damage control, the kind of voice that had probably smoothed over 100 uncomfortable boardroom moments before this one. Whatever disagreement, it stopped being private, I said. The moment it became the reason I almost died. I hadn't planned to say that sentence. It came out of some older, rawer part of me, the part that still remembered a ceiling tile shaped like Ohio, and the room went silent in a different way after it, a way that had nothing left in it for anyone to perform through. My mother had gone very still in her chair, the burgundy gown suddenly looking like something draped over a mannequin instead of a person. My grandfather, I continued steadier now, left a trust in my name that activated when I turned 34 months ago. For 8 years before that, my mother managed it as trustee. During that time, she drew management fees of $14,200 annually. That part, my lawyers tell me, was technically within her rights. What was not within her rights were 3 transfers totaling $133,500 taken from that trust and never repaid, each one occurring within 6 weeks of a financial hardship she described to me verbally, in person, usually at her kitchen table over a pot roast she always overcooked. A few people laughed. A startled, uncomfortable sound quickly swallowed. I want to be specific because I've learned specifics are the only thing that can't be argued with later. $30,000 in March 4 years ago. The same month I signed a life insurance policy naming her as contingent beneficiary, a policy I was told was for my protection. $42,500 18 months after that. $61,000 11 months ago, 3 weeks before she suggested gently, over dinner, that it might be smarter to consolidate my accounts under her choice of advisor. Lenora Argyle at the head table had not moved or spoken once, but I watched her set down her water glass with great deliberateness, the wedding ring loose on her finger, catching the chandelier light, and I understood she was the silent side character the room needed, the one whose stillness would carry more weight than anyone's outburst. "There's one more document," I said, and Renata handed me the last page. "This is the inheritance clause governing tonight's share transfer. It specifies that the controlling share passes to Preston if the marriage has not ended in divorce or documented infidelity by the 5th anniversary, which is 9 days from now. What it doesn't specify, because no one expected to need it specified, this is what happens if the marriage itself was procured through documented financial coercion by the recipient and a third party acting for material gain. My attorney filed a motion this morning to have that question answered by a court with all of tonight's documentation attached as exhibits before any transfer is finalized." Preston's face, when I finally looked at him directly, had stopped performing entirely. There was no mask left on it, just a kind of stunned, calculating blankness, the same blankness I imagined had been underneath his face the morning he watched me sign a stack of papers in a kitchen with yellow stripes of sun across the counter and told me, gently, "You don't want to be the reason this falls through, do you? You knew," he said finally to my mother, not to me. "You said she'd never look this closely." It was, I would think later, the single most honest sentence either of them said all night, and it landed in front of 200 witnesses, a board, a reporter from the Hartford Business Journal with her pen already moving, and a 91-year-old woman who had been waiting 5 years to see someone finally figure it out before it was too late. I think, Ezra Whitlock said, very carefully into the silence that followed, the board will need to postpone tonight's transfer pending legal review. He looked briefly, profoundly relieved to have a procedural sentence to hide behind. My mother found her voice last, the way she always did, reaching for the gentle tone that had worked on me for 30 years. "Naomi, sweetheart, you're embarrassing yourself in front of people who matter." It was almost the same sentence she'd said to me in another life, at another wedding, about another guest list, and this time I didn't flinch at it because I finally understood it had never once been a sentence about me. It was the only sentence she knew how to say when she was the one losing the room. "I used to think that sentence meant something," I said. "I don't anymore." I sat down. I did not watch what happened to her face after that because I'd promised myself in Renata's office weeks earlier that the moment the evidence was on the table, I would let the room do the rest of the work, and the room did. 2 board members rose within the minute and quietly excused themselves toward the lobby, already on their phones. A woman I didn't know, the wife of a shareholder, leaned toward my mother and said something too low for me to hear, and my mother's face, when she turned away from it, had nothing gentle left in it at all. What came after didn't happen all in one night, the way television revenge always seems to, but it happened steadily in the weeks that followed, the way real consequences usually do, slower than you want and more complete than you expected. The board's legal review, helped considerably by Dorian Vance's notarized accounting and Carol Musina's recorded statement, concluded that the marriage had indeed been materially induced through undisclosed third-party financial inducement. Language dry enough for a filing cabinet and devastating enough to void the inheritance clause entirely. The controlling share reverted to the company's general holding structure, to be redistributed among existing shareholders, none of whom were named Argyle by marriage. Preston kept his 40% ownership stake, the part that had always been legitimately his, but lost the additional $19 million in controlling interest he'd spent 5 years performing a marriage to secure, and within 4 months he'd been quietly eased out of his operating role by a board that no longer trusted his judgment, replaced by his own cousin, a detail I learned from Lenora over tea at Brightwell Manor and found, to my mild surprise, didn't make me feel anything at all. He had simply become a man I used to know, the way a hallway you once lived at the end of becomes eventually just a hallway. My mother lost more and lost it more publicly because Garrett Holm, facing his own scrutiny from the state bar over the retainer arrangement, declined to keep representing her. And without his cover, the recovery action Renata filed on my behalf for the $133,500 in undocumented trust withdrawals moved forward with no one in the room defending her version of events. She sold the house on Maple Ridge Road, the one whose roof my father's insurance had paid for, the one she'd refinanced twice without ever once telling me. To cover the judgment, and moved into a 2-bedroom condo in Bloomfield that I have seen exactly once from the outside because Aunt Marisol asked me to drive her past it after a doctor's appointment, and I didn't have a good enough reason to say no. The relationship consequence, the one I hadn't planned for and almost didn't survive emotionally, was Aunt Marisol herself, who called me 3 weeks after the gala, her voice rough, and told me she'd spent the drive home that night thinking about the parking lot at my father's funeral 12 years earlier when she'd whispered a warning and then never once followed up on it. Never once checked whether I'd actually heeded it, never once asked the harder questions in the years after. I knew something was wrong with how your mother talked about you, she said, and I let it be your problem instead of mine. I'm sorry it took you almost dying to make me say that out loud. I told her I forgave her and meant it because she at least had the decency to feel the weight of what she'd ignored, which was more than I could say for almost anyone else who'd stood near that kitchen counter for the last 9 years. The fate reversal came 11 months after the gala, smaller than I expected and somehow more satisfying for it. My mother, needing a co-signer for the lease on the Bloomfield condo after her credit took the hit from the judgment, asked Ma through Aunt Marisol because she could no longer bring herself to call me directly whether I would consider it. I thought about a hospital room and a ceiling tile and a sentence about being dramatic when sick. I thought about a nurse named Denise and an IV line and a phone that rang twice and was never answered. I told Marisol gently the same gentleness my mother used to weaponize and that I had finally learned to use honestly. I hope she finds somewhere good. I can't be the one who guarantees it for her. It wasn't cruelty. It was the first complete sentence of refusal I had ever given that woman in either life, and saying it out loud didn't feel like victory so much as it felt like setting down something heavy I'd been carrying since I was 26 and didn't even remember picking up. I bought a house that spring, a modest 3-bedroom on Glenwood Avenue in West Hartford with a sagging back porch I planned to rebuild myself, board by board, because I'd spent a career making other people's old structures safe again, and it felt right to finally do it for something that was entirely mine. I closed on it on a Thursday in May for $112,000, paid mostly from the trust my grandfather Eli had set aside for me before I was born and that no one had been able to touch since the day I turned 30, and finally asked what was owed to me. The last image I keep from that whole stretch of my life, the one I come back to, the one that feels like the actual ending more than any document or any roomful of stunned shareholders, is a quieter one. It was a Sunday evening, maybe 6 weeks after I'd moved in, and I was standing on the back porch with a box of new locks I'd bought at a hardware store on New Park Avenue, $34.99 each, 3 of them for the front door, the side door, and the gate to the yard. I changed every lock myself slowly, with my own hands, checking each mechanism twice before I moved to the next, the way I check every beam before I sign off on it, and when I was done, I stood in the kitchen with the old kikes in my palm, small, dull brass things that had opened doors for people who'd never deserved to walk through them, and I dropped them into a coffee can I keep on a high shelf for exactly that purpose. The soft metal clatter, the only sound in a house that finally, after 2 lifetimes, belonged only to me. Trust isn't weakness. Giving it twice to the same person after they've already shown you what they'll do with it is the part that costs you everything. Some doors aren't meant to be reopened. They're meant to be locked from the inside by the person who finally learned where the key was the whole time. If this one got under your skin the way it got under mine, to write it, tell me which moment hit hardest in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, the kind that make you sit with your coffee a little longer than you meant to, subscribe and stay a while.